Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Albany. My name is Irita London, and I am the Service Associate today. This morning, we will welcome to our pulpit Jacob King, who is our new ministerial intern. Jacob King, pronouns he, him, is a third-year student at Star King School for the ministry. Jacob has moved to Albany from Oregon with his spouse, Carmen, along with 3 cats and a dog. Jacob is excited to get to meet all of you over these coming months and looks forward to serving with the congregation. Okay, this is the call to celebration. I will do a reading from the Reverend Tracy Lynn. She is a retired Episcopal priest and city planner whose ministry has included work for social and environmental justice, interfaith relationships, sustainable urban development, arts and culture, and progressive theology. Most recently, Reverend Lynn's ministry has extended to include the spiritual insights and lessons she has gained from a life complicated by dementia. She also is author of the book and photo journal called Interruption by God, Glimpses from the Edge. We will begin with Reverend Tracy's words, and she writes, "Hey God, why all the suffering?" There are some Bible stories that are so familiar that we think we know them, but we really don't. The book of Job is one of them. The book of Job is so compelling that these are in her words, I spent a week reading translations, both ancient and modern, commentary after commentary, as well as some amazing poetry insight by ancient texts. Job addresses the perennial question, why do bad things happen to good people? Where is God in our suffering? As liberal theologian Gustavo Gutierrez writes, the book of Job does not claim to have found a rational or definitive explanation of suffering. It is a sacred text that leaves us with more questions than answers. Written for a highly educated Jewish audience, Job is a dramatic poem bookended by popular folktale. The prologue tells a story that sets the stage for a profound drama involving God, a member of the heavenly court named Al-Satan, not to be confused with Satan, the devil, a righteous man named Job, his unnamed wife, his children and friends. The epilogue offers a settlement without resolve. The storyline is simple. Job was a just, wise, humble, and charitable man. His wealth and virtue aroused jealousy and curiosity in the divine consort. So one day, Al-Satan, whose name derives from the Hebrew word for obstruction or opposition, asks God if he could test Job's righteousness and fidelity. God gave permission, but insisted that Al-Satan not physically harm him. So Al-Satan arranged for Job's animals and children to be killed. Upon learning his tragic loss, Job fell to the ground in grief, but did not blame or insult God. In other words, he didn't fail the test. So Al-Satan wasn't satisfied with the outcome, and he asked God if he could test Job some more. So Satan affected Job with boils and a very bad skin disease. And his wife, upon witnessing his suffering, his wife encouraged him to blame God, but our protagonist remained faithful. She then vanished from the story. Maybe she left Job in his time of need. Maybe Job sent her away. Or maybe she was struck down by the lack of faith. We're not told. In the epilogue, God showed up, scolded the friends. Job's friends gave him advice to get all angry with God and why was all this happening? But in the end, God showed up and rewarded Job for his fidelity. giving him a new home, new fortune, a new wife, and new children. The traditional moral of this tale is when you are faced with hard times, don't be tempted to relinquish your faith in God. God has reasons beyond your understanding for what God is doing. And if you hold on to your faith long enough, God will reward your suffering. In the end, Job accepted that suffering is part of life and that God sometimes allows it and chooses not to stop it. He also concluded that God is beyond human understanding and accountability, and he learned that God shows up in the midst of suffering. But was Job remorseful or resentful? We really do not know. The story from the Holocaust illustrates this point. An old man digging out a filthy latrine as a Nazi guard stood over him. The guard said to the old man, "Now where is your God?" The old man replied, "Right here in the muck with me." I don't blame God for my condition. God didn't cause it. However, I want and need to believe that God is in the muck with me and will not abandon me as my dementia advances. Like Job, whose faith, wisdom, endurance, and kaputs offered me comfort and encouragement, I am convinced that my Redeemer lives and at the last will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has thus destroyed, then in my flesh I will see God. And when I do, I have a lot of questions to ask. The prelude will be played is Preludium by Clara Schulman. It will be presented by Anne Brandon. Please join in the chalice lighting. Words are on the screen. Well, the words aren't on the screen, but I hope you know them. I'll go through them very slowly. Welcoming all free seekers of truth and meaning, we gather to excite the human spirit, to inspire its growth and development, to respond morally and ethically to a troubled world, and to sustain a vital and nurturing religious community. Next, we'll sing a unison song. The words will appear on the screen. This time, I know they will. Please join in singing Come Sing a Song with Me, words and music by Carol McDade, song leader, Anne Brandon. Welcome to our Facebook friends who will be joining us now for our service. My name is Irita London, and I am the Service Associates today. We welcome to the pulpit Jacob King, who is our new ministerial intern.
Greetings, everyone, and our friends on Facebook, Zoom, or wherever you are. We know you're with us in spirit for today. As you can tell, if you have the sermon title, it was very creative for this week. It's called Meet the Intern. So I guess we should identify what exactly is a ministerial intern. So our faith tradition heavily believes in the process of formation, both spiritual formation, academic formation, and emotional formation. And part of what our faith tradition expects for ministers is in part of that formation. It's a complete holistic approach for the academic side As Irita mentioned, I'm in the third year of seminary at Star King School for the Ministry, and there's other readings and development that goes around that. The emotional and mental health side, they require ministers that are people pursuing ministry to go through what's called a career assessment. It's a complete holistic psychological evaluation and gives some great feedback about who you are as a person and who I am. And on the spiritual side, it's by becoming part of a congregation such as yourself or my congregation I'm leaving behind, but still in spirit with back home, the Unitarian Universalist of Corvallis. And so as the ministerial intern, I'll be working under Reverend Sam over the course of these many 9 months, and getting to meet with many of you I've already met now, and we'll get to continue to know and get to join the committees, and all of that is the goal of these 9 months, is for me to be able to support you spiritually and for you to be able to support me spiritually, emotionally, mentally as I go through this process, and know that one day I'll be leading the faith with you guys on my hearts and minds. So now that we got the introduction, as we continue, every journey starts somewhere. And I was not born into the UU tradition. I was actually born in what you would consider the polar opposite of the liberal tradition. I was born and raised in a theological tradition called the Assemblies of God. If you are not familiar with the Assemblies of God, if you've ever read the New Testament, there's an event called the Pentecost. Allegedly, in the book of Acts for the Bible, there was an incident where followers of the early Christian community, or at that time, many of them still identified as part of the Judaic tradition, allegedly were able to understand each other almost as a reverse Tower of Babel. And with the Assemblies of God tradition, while growing up, many of the ministers and guest speakers will sometimes speak in what's called tongues. So it's a way for them to connect with the Spirit of divine. And while our tradition, it would be hard felt to have a minister up here speaking in tongues, we do recognize people's freedom of conscience to, if that's what spiritually is drawn upon to them. The issue I had with the Assemblies of God, which is much different from the liberal tradition, is for the starters to join their tradition, you have to attest to a statement of faith. As you know, we do not require any statement of faith within the U tradition. We have 7 values and 6 sources, which can be best summarized as an act of love. And with that credence, unfortunately, it does not give room for questioning that credence. And so growing up in Bible studies or other groups my family would make me go, I would often wonder when reading texts such as the book of Jonah, and having been a 3rd grade biology student, knowing that it'd be physically impossible for someone to survive in a whale's belly for 3 days. But unfortunately, the tradition I was part of didn't enjoy those questions. It was heavily discouraged. And so it was, when you were worshiping, it's almost different when you worship with U tradition, for those that haven't grown up with the evangelical or conservative position. When you grow up with UU, there might be items on the board that you read, but when it comes to the actual act of worship, what's going on in your heart, soul, and mind, it's entirely up to you whether you participate or not. Where in many evangelical conservative traditions, it's while they draw upon a breadth of experience and they want to serve their community, that act of questioning is not encouraged when it should be encouraged. That's what our early Unitarians and our early Universalists, if you looked at objectively, that's what separated them from that tradition, is they were not afraid to question what was being presented to them. What eventually drew me away from the faith entirely was one of the aspects of the Assemblies of God when it comes to the LGBTQ community. They believe in biblical literalism, and their interpretation is that homosexuality is a sin to be condemned and an afterlife waiting for them that isn't heaven. That is not what I personally believe. That is how I was raised. And it was right around when I was 13 that I realized I was a member of the LGBTQ community. I didn't openly identify, but I started realizing I was most likely bisexual. That's what the term is nowadays. I didn't know what the term was at that time. I just knew that what they were preaching to me and what they were reading to me, I thought I was living in complete sin. I tried to pray the gay away, if you will, but as we know, that's not, you can't change biology, you can't change nature, you can't change God's love and plan for you. And I couldn't leave that tradition. That's another hard part, especially when parents make their children attend a service. You can't escape. And so until my 18th birthday, I was, even with having doubts of who I was and what I was believing, I couldn't leave that faith tradition until, like many 18-year-olds in the Midwest or in other isolated areas wanting to get out of their prison, I joined the US military. And so, like every recruiter, they tell you you're not going to deploy anywhere. And I believed my recruiter until I enrolled in college. And a month after coming back from basic training, I got sent to Iraq. So my recruiter was not very supportive of that. During that period from 18 until around 21, I did not believe in a God. I did not believe in any faith traditions. I was narrow-minded. I thought all faith traditions were like the one that I had just left, where you had to absolutely believe this or you'll go to hell. And while many Unitarian Universalists don't believe in hell, many of the faith traditions we draw upon do have people in that tradition that do believe in it. And it's an unfortunate reality in our world. It's hard to explain for those that didn't grow up in a belief in hell. When you believe you're living in sin and that as a result of that sin, you're going to be tortured for all eternity in some fiery depths, you're willing to do almost anything for what the minister or the preacher or the faith tradition is telling you so you can avoid that. It's Machiavellian, living through fear, not love, which that is not what this tradition abides. And so after my deployment, a short time, I found my wife, Carmen, my spouse, Carmen, and we got married shortly after about 3 to 4 months of dating. I realized it was a gift from God at that moment that I had her in my life, because before I met her, when I left Iraq, and like many veterans, I lived in anger for a while. And I remember my manager at work called me over and said, "Is something wrong?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Well, it's the first time I've seen you smile in a year and a half." Shortly after our marriage, I was sent to the Arizona border against my will, because then the former president believed it was a national crisis that needed military intervention to deal with. And I remember I was still not part of a faith tradition. I didn't really identify one way or the other politically. I remember reading the news at that time where they were saying they were putting women and children in jail cells, and I thought that couldn't be true. No reasonable person would do that. And then my first day at a Border Patrol headquarters in the Tucson sector, I watched women and children actually be separated from each other, then put in the jail cell. So that's what the news got wrong. It's not that they weren't being put into jail cells, they weren't being put into jail cells together. And as we know, the psychological damage of separating a son or daughter from their loved one is something that's going to take years of healing. When I was working for Border Patrol on behalf of the National Guard, I was in a camera room where I was able to see most of the border. So it's the way they have it set up is people sit in a camera room, you point the camera when you see someone crossing, and then oftentimes a Border Patrol agent will either fly there or they'll drive there and they'll interdict. One thing they were having us do about 2 months into the mission is, we didn't think anything of it at the time, but they said, if you see misguided people leaving food and water along the trails of the border, go ahead and call the federal parks and they'll go give them a ticket. I didn't agree that it was a crime or a ticketable offense to leave food and water, especially with our national heritage that I take so kindly of that statue that's 2 hours away from us that says, give us your torrent tossed, give us your weary, you're hungry, you're downtrodden. But who am I? Not everyone takes their constitutional oaths to heart, apparently. But so that's what we did for about a period of a month. Anytime we would see, I mean, it's pretty obvious to spot, most people are driving regular vehicles along the border, and they're much different than the Border Patrol vehicles. And so we would call in the federal parks, they would go issue a ticket. It wasn't until about the 5th time that I made that phone call that I realized someone in the administration at that time found a loophole in the federal law that if they had a certain amount of tickets, they could be taken away and tried for a federal crime for up to maximum sentence of 20 years. And so you can imagine the shock on my face when I saw a group of people being taken away in a Border Patrol vehicle to be arrested and tried, attempted to try at a later date. It was at that moment that I kind of I already had moral misgivings, but then I realized that moment I cannot consciously, morally, ethically support this in any fashion. And so I looked up what the group was called. They're called No Las Muertes, No More Deaths, and I did some research on it. And this name kept popping up that I couldn't recognize what it had to do with no more deaths. But it said Unitarian Universalist. What is that? What does that have to do with no more deaths? And so I looked up. It was actually half a mile away from my apartment there in Tucson, because the Tucson UU congregation is about a mile away from the Tucson sector Border Patrol headquarters. So I went there. My initial thought is I thought it was like a club. I didn't realize it was an actual faith tradition. And I walked in and I saw the banners, No Las Muertes. I was like, yep, I'm in the right place. This is about February of that year. And I remember sitting down and I quickly realized, okay, this is some form of service. But what I couldn't figure out is what theological background it was, because it was an anniversary of Martin Luther King, and the entire point of the service was around Dr. King, Reverend Dr. King's life. And I know what a rainbow looks like, and that's what I described to my wife walking into that congregation. I didn't know what to think of it. Growing up in an evangelical conservative position, most of the people were white, cisgender, of a upper class or middle class background, where when I walked into this congregation, I saw members of the local Muslim community, members of the local Sikh community. I saw more diversity in that building than I'd ever seen even in a US military unit. And something struck at not my heart, not my mind, but where I consider the spirit. And I just felt at home. I had been moving around with the military for many years, and this was the first time I had felt somewhere at home. And so I went again and again, and about that 3rd time, I realized that I was being no longer as a visitor, no longer as a guest, but that I was being called by some divine entity, some divine spirit of love. And so I went to the local Air Force base. I asked to speak with the chaplain. Even when I was in an atheist agnostic stage, I had fairly good rapport with chaplains. They do great work for the soldiers. And I asked them, what do you do to get to where you are? And they rambled on with all the requirements. You need a master's of divinity. I don't know what that is. You need X, Y, Z. You need an ecclesiastical endorser. You need to be ordained. You need to do the CP. And all of it led me to, I asked, where is this faith tradition most concentrated? I remember asking a member of the UU or Tucson congregation. They said, well, there's a lot of congregations and there's a school nearby in the Oregon, California area. And so that's where I went. And during that time, as we said, the UU makes sure that their candidates get a holistic experience. And I remember before I was even allowed to start classes, I had to attest to agree to go through not psychological evaluation, but actually counseling. And just because they witnessed that traumas that I had in my life, along with the faith, needed to be addressed. That's what I did. Went through 1.5 years of counseling. I never felt freer since. And it's been a journey just to get here, but as you can see, it's addressing, the way they design it is it's supposed to address the whole proponent of who's going to one day be a minister. Because as ministers, we're visible leaders of the faith, but we're also a conduit within the congregation to continue to grow the faith. Because our tradition is not static. It's not limited just to the words of a religious text or a scriptural text. It is a living, growing being. And so that's where I'll leave today, is where I believe UU is going forward. Why do I feel drawn to continue serving? Because on the outset, I met the basics of what it would take to become at least freed from my previous imprisonment. I don't no longer identify with the tradition I left. I've gone through the counseling. I've gone through the studies. I don't need to continue on without having a clear purpose or goal in mind. And that clear purpose and goal is our tradition is still 250 years later from the Universalist perspective, 300 to 400 years from the Trinitarian, Unitarian perspective, given your understanding, it's still under attack today. With the Nolas Muertes, as I said, the people, when they were arrested, the federal government attempted to charge them, and they ran into a roadblock. The Freedom of Religious Restoration Act. It's a minor law released in the 90s under President Clinton, and the general synopsis of it was the federal government cannot impede on your religious right without providing either some alternative, or it has to be the lowest form of impediment. They couldn't impede on the Nolas Muertes because they felt spiritually, divinely called to save women, men, and children, regardless of background, regardless of creed, on the border in accordance with our values. And there's very dangerous wording that the Arizona Attorney General for the state wrote in his disposition after they were unable to charge the crimes. He says, "We, the people, will not tolerate human trafficking. We will not tolerate drug trafficking. And we will not tolerate interdiction by morally misguided individuals." Morally misguided individuals. And that's, by saying that last statement, he's doing two things. Misguidance, so that way it's a blanket statement that whatever they're believing is wrong. And he used the word moral very carefully because he knew the reason the entire case got dropped, it wasn't because they had just moral misguidance. They had religious and spiritual belief, strongly held spiritual religious belief that compelled them, and the federal government could not impede on that right. So by calling it a moral misguidance, they're attempting to articulate that we're not a faith. They're attempting to articulate that we're not a spiritual tradition. They're attempting to articulate that we're not a religious tradition. And this is clearly defined in many other areas of our world and society. Even in the 90s, there was a interfaith Christian alliance in Europe that tried to exclude Unitarian Universalism because they didn't view they were Christian enough. And that's, while we're not purely a Christian denomination anymore, we recognize the spirit, divine influence of all the world's major faith traditions. At least on the outset, when people see the term Unitarian or Universalist, that's what they appeal by, as they presume it's some form of Protestantism. And at least the Army still makes UU chaplains wear the Protestant cross, even if it's not something they completely uphold or believe in. And so when you're when you're going through your formation stages, which for all of us, it's a lifetime of learning, our values encourage that growth. Our values encourage that change within us. Where you were at when you were 20 and might be completely different where you're at when you're 40. And that's perfectly fine. This entire book, the Bible, which this one I have, the New Learning Translation, there in both the rabbinic Judaic tradition and the Christian tradition, the key word that UUs draw upon and lean on their formation on all things in life is the simple words that are found in all the world's traditions, all the world's non-theistic traditions. It's the love your neighbor as yourself. That's what UU still has a place in this society for, because we're still fighting the same battles our ancestors fought 50 years ago, because people just can't remember the love your neighbor as yourself. I'll leave you guys today with a reading from the book of 1 John, verse 4, chapter 4. It says, remember that God is love, and all who live in love live in God. God is love, and all who live in love live in God. Thank you.
Before we go on, I have a quick announcement to make. There is a red Camry parked in the bus stop that will get towed. Please move it to the other side of Washington Avenue. So if anybody has a red Camry parked in the bus stop, it will get towed, and it's good to move it. An important way we celebrate life each Sunday is by offering an opportunity to practice generosity. Members and friends support our congregation with an annual pledge paid throughout the year. Another way to support the good work of the congregation is by making a generous contribution as we pass the plate, or via one of the options shown on the next slide. If you are joining us virtually, you can click the tiny URL in the link to the chat window to contribute, or you can send a text to the number shown on the screen. The examples on the slide show how to label your text to indicate the amount and purpose of your gift. We must say goodbye to our Facebook friends. Consider joining us on Zoom next time, or visit us at 405 Washington Avenue, Albany. You can find more information at albanyuu.org. Our offertory music is Reminiscent by Ibod.
As we do our prayer of affirmation this week from our joys and sorrows, I just want to recognize and thank those who stood up and those online and those who said their joy or sorrow in spirit, recognizing we live in very difficult times. Loved ones are getting ill. The society is facing uprisings, and as our fellow congregant mentioned, a reminder of Emmett Till's untimely and unjust demise. During tough times, I like to lean on this Bless All Who Serve. It's a prayer book made by the UU tradition. And it's intended for anyone, but it's mainly geared towards soldiers, veterans, and families. Says, this is from Reinhold Niebuhr, who's a theologian you might be familiar with. God, Spirit of love, Spirit divine, give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things that should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. Maybe so.
As we extinguish the challenge, please join in the words on the screen. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we come together again.
As many of us go out to face the many challenges of the week, or in Irita's case, the work she'll be doing in an hour for her employer, remember that within this community, even outside of Sundays, it's always in your heart and love. And for those of the guests we have today who are new or maybe are coming back to you traditionally, remind that by simply being present in this moment, by simply being here and supporting, you are doing an act of social justice. Social justice is a crucial part of the ministry that Unitarian Universalist offers. It's, yes, we recognize the just shall live through faith, but our values attest that there's also justice in faith and through faith. By supporting the congregation, you are supporting items within the community, such as the benevolent grants we give to Sheridan Preparatory Academy and the local food banks. On a state level, you're supporting legislation and litigation against unjust acts in accordance with the human rights law. And on a national scale, you're supporting currently the fight to bring back the right to abortion. And you're also fighting for items such as Beacon Press, which is our public publishing wing, and what brings into our modern lexicon many words you're not familiar with, such as critical race theory or white fragility. Thank you.
Our thanks to musician Ann Brandon, ushers Al DeSalvo, Don Dana, pastoral care associate Eric Van Housen, service associate me, Irita London, welcomers Amy Lint, greeter Linda Way, office support Tammy Goddard, Patience Blachette, technical support Kevin Yeh, Fred Ames. Announcements. Please join us for cookies and lemonade in the back of Community Hall after service. Join a meeting manners group in a small group discussion, growth and development program at Albany UU led by Reverend Sam. The program meets monthly from September to June. For more information, contact Reverend Sam at minister@albanyuu.org.